Early this morning, the U.S. captured Venezuela's dictator Nicolás Maduro and his wife in a daring military raid, and he's now en route to the American homeland to stand trial for his crimes. But everyone's screaming this was illegal, brazenly unconstitutional, and violated international law. Well, they're wrong, and I'm going to prove it. Welcome to the Restless Signal, home of the War of Ideas. Support our mission by subscribing now. I don't usually do real-time takes, but this is an important historical event, and I've got a lot to say. In this short video, I'm going to explain why the legal objections against the U.S. raid don't hold up. Also, I plan on dealing with the broader strategic considerations, moral implications, and this event's impact on the macro-ideological competition between Marxism and liberalism in a longer episode, coming soon. But let's get into these specific legal objections. And spoiler alert, they're nonsense. First objection, this was brazenly illegal under international law. Let's deal directly with the international law objection because it sounds authoritative, and it really isn't. When people say this was illegal under international law, what they almost always mean is the United Nations Charter, specifically Article 2, Section 4, which prohibits the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. That sounds decisive, doesn't it? Well, it isn't. First, there's no absolute prohibition in international law against acting against the head of state or head of government. Head of state immunity, where it exists, is functional, not metaphysical, and it always admits exceptions, especially for leaders who lack legitimacy, preside over criminal enterprises, or cause cross-border harm. That's why extraditions, sanctions, and universal jurisdiction claims and international tribunals all exist. Second, the UN Charter itself contains explicit exceptions. Article 51 recognizes the inherent right of self-defense. Over time, state practice has consistently interpreted that to include ongoing threats and criminal regimes that export harm across borders. Venezuela under Maduro was not a neutral state minding its own business. It was a narco state exporting drugs, instability, and migration pressure throughout the region and into the United States. For example, in 2022, the U.S. Department of Justice indicted Maduro on narco-terrorism charges. That was under the Biden administration. The Treasury Department also designated Venezuela a major drug transit country. So this wasn't a normal state. It was a criminal enterprise. Under the Charter's own logic, that matters. Now, international legalists will still object. They'll say something like, but drug trafficking isn't an armed attack under Article 51, so self-defense doesn't apply. And that objection reveals everything wrong with the current international order. When your legal framework says that a regime exporting 250 metric tons of cocaine annually, drugs that kill thousands of Americans, fund organized crime, and destabilize an entire hemisphere, doesn't constitute a threat justifying a state response, then your framework is morally bankrupt. The UN Charter was written in 1945 to prevent wars between nation states with standing armies. It wasn't designed for narco states operating as transnational criminal enterprises. The fact that the rules-based order treats that kind of ongoing harm as something democracies must simply tolerate, that's not law serving justice. That's procedure protecting evil. And here's an even deeper problem for the international law crowd, and this is where their objection collapses. The entire UN Charter framework assumes a legitimate sovereign state is a party to the treaty. That assumption does all the work, and in this case, it simply doesn't hold. The idea that Nicolás Maduro was the lawful sovereign leader of Venezuela is deeply contested. Elections were fraudulent. Opposition victories were nullified. Candidates were barred from participating. Large portions of the Venezuela population never recognized his authority, and multiple countries have refused to recognize his government as legitimate, including multiple U.S. administrations and the European Union. So international legalists are asking us to accept an absurd premise. If a regime seizes power unlawfully and holds it by force, international law treats that power as untouchable sovereignty. But if another actor uses force to correct that injustice, that is illegal. That's not law. It's might makes right, but only for bad actors. And it gets worse. International law has no independent enforcement mechanism. It operates through institutions like the UN Security Council, where actions are routinely blocked for political reasons. In practice, this means international law restrains compliant states, while criminal regimes learn how to exploit procedural paralysis. Which brings us to the uncomfortable truth. The UN Charter and the broader post-World War II legal order were built for a world where great powers agree to restrain themselves in exchange for stability. That bargain only works if all sides act in good faith. When the system reliably protects narco-states and entrenches injustice, states stop treating it as moral authority. So no, this wasn't clearly illegal under international law. International law that cannot correct obvious evil does not deserve blind obedience. And that's a real issue people are struggling to admit. Let's move on to the domestic law objection, because this one is repeated constantly and almost always incorrectly. You'll hear people say, only Congress can authorize war. Therefore, this was unconstitutional. That claim rests on an assumption that has never been confirmed by the courts. The Constitution gives the Congress the power to declare war. It does not say that only Congress can authorize every use of military force. Those are not the same thing. Article 2 of the Constitution makes the president commander-in-chief, and from the very beginning of the Republic, presidents have used military force without declarations of war or authorizations of use of military force. They've done it to protect American citizens, respond to threats, suppress criminal actors, enforce national interests, and conduct limited operations short of full-scale war. This isn't a loophole. It's 2 centuries of constitutional practice. Critically, the courts have never held that the president lacks authority to conduct limited military or enforcement actions absent a declaration of war. When these questions have reached the judiciary, courts have consistently declined to impose the rigid rule critics now assert. Since World War II alone, presidents have used military force hundreds of times without declarations of war. Korea, Kosovo, Libya, the list goes on. This isn't new. It's how American constitutional practice has worked for over 200 years and increasingly worked in the modern post-war era. Furthermore, claims about the war power resolution are misplaced. Every president since it was passed in 1973 has maintained the position that it itself is unconstitutional. Regardless, in this case, it requires presidential notification of hostilities within 48 hours and a congressional approval if the hostilities continue within 60 days. In this case, the notification requirement was met. Congress's behavior here matters too. Congress has repeatedly acquiesced through funding, silence, and after-the-fact authorizations for uses of military force in the past. And under constitutional doctrine, that acquiescence is legally meaningful. This wasn't a declared war, but it wasn't a sustained campaign requiring national mobilization. It was a limited, targeted use of force, exactly the kind presidents of both parties have exercised repeatedly and a practice that Congress has repeatedly tolerated. So when people say this was clearly unconstitutional, what they really mean is this violates a constitutional theory on use of war powers that I prefer. That's not settled law, and it confuses classroom civics with how American constitutional order has actually functioned for over 200 years. On domestic law grounds alone, the claim of clear unconstitutionality simply doesn't hold up. But even that's not the end of the story, because legality, even perfect legality, is not the same thing as justice and morality. And that's where we go to next. So even if this was illegal, so what? Let's assume something for the sake of argument. Let's assume, even though I don't concede it, that this action violated international law. And let's assume, again, purely for the sake of argument, that it pushed the outer edge of domestic legal authority. Even then, this still does not settle the real question, whether this was moral and just. Because following the law is not the same thing as justice or morality. In the wake of World War II, when the world established the so-called rules-based order, we inverted the moral hierarchy. We started treating adherence to procedure as the highest good, as if following the rules automatically made an action moral, regardless of the outcome. We told ourselves that if leaders checked the right boxes, they were absolved of responsibility. That is a mistake. Law is a human system. Procedure is a tool for ordinary governance. They exist to serve the good, not to replace moral judgment. When procedures entrench obvious evil, fidelity to them is not a virtue. It's cowardice disguised as regulatory compliance. And this is not a radical claim. It's foundational and it's part of the Christian moral inheritance that underwrites Western civilization. Under our philosophical inheritance, rulers are accountable for justice. They are not permitted to outsource moral responsibility to legalisms. As St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, laws may be just or unjust. Unjust laws do not bind the conscience. It may carry force, but it lacks moral authority. More poignantly, St. Augustine wrote, quote, "An unjust law is no law at all." Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not endorsing anarchy. Legal procedures are fine and necessary for day-to-day governance. They reduce arbitrariness. They create stability. But my point is, they are not the end of the story. At some point, when a grave injustice is occurring, someone has to decide whether the system itself has become part of the injustice. And when that happens, leaders don't answer for whether they followed a broken process perfectly. They answer for what they allowed to continue. That's the part modern legalism doesn't want to face. It prefers process without judgment, rules without responsibility, and stability without justice. It results in the perverse outcome where a bloodthirsty dictator can remain in power for years, oppressing lawful opposition, violating human rights en masse, destroying a vibrant economy that results in poverty and famine for millions, so bad that the UN estimates that 7.7 million Venezuelans fled out of a population of approximately 28 million. The worst refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. Not to mention the misery his government exported to other countries, including the United States, in the form of drug smuggling, immigration pressures, and transnational crime. The rule-based order crowd says allowing that human tragedy to continue unopposed is legal and therefore the moral decision. That's fundamentally unjust, and how you know the rule-based order is morally bankrupt and long past time it's discarded for moral realism. History doesn't judge leaders by how faithfully they adhere to procedures that everyone knew were failing. It judges them by outcomes, by whether they acted when evil was clear and harm was ongoing. That's the burden of authority and leadership. So even if this action made people uncomfortable, even if it violated legal norms that no longer serve the good, that discomfort doesn't make it wrong. Sometimes the most dangerous thing a society can do is confuse rule following with morality. And finally, that confusion is exactly what's collapsing now in the West. And we're rediscovering our North Star. And one final thought before we close. Critics will say, even if this is legal, it's a dangerous precedent. If the US can do this, what stops other countries? Spoiler alert, we're already there, and we always have been. Russia took Crimea. China fortifies the South China Sea and flouts international tribunal rulings as it relates to the Philippines. NATO overthrew Gaddafi and justified it on humanitarian grounds later. And the list could go on and on. The rules-based order didn't stop them. It gave their victims a forum to complain while accepting the outcome. What actually prevents routine regime change isn't rules. It's power, interests, and risk calculation. It always has been. The difference is we're no longer pretending otherwise. The post-World War II order tried to substitute legal procedure for power. It tried to impose something amounting to a domestic legal order on sovereign nations. The fiction that we can actually do that is collapsing. Not because President Trump violated it, but because everyone already was, and we're finally admitting it, and we're stopping letting procedures be an impediment to good triumphing over clear evil. Anyway, so that's why the legal objections don't hold. Next time, I'll show you what this operation reveals about the War of Ideas. We'll walk through the War of Ideas framework, showing how Marxism is collapsing the Western Hemisphere. while managerial elites matter more than ideology in this case, and what this signals about American strategy going forward. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for listening, and until next time, seek truth, wrestle with meaning, live well, and keep the signal clear. You've been listening to the Restless Signal podcast, copyright 2026, all rights reserved. Check us out on the web at warofideas.com.